In the 14th century, Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe, unaware that death was already in the air. The Black Death arrived silently, traveling along trade routes, carried by ships, fleas, and fear. Victims fell ill without warning, suffering unbearable pain as strange black swellings spread across their bodies. With no cure, people turned to desperate remedies, pram, and superstition, believing the plague was God's punishment. Death overwhelmed entire cities, forcing the living to bury the dead in mass graves without names or farewells.
By the end, nearly half of Europe's population was gone, leaving towns abandoned and societies broken.
The Black Death became a turning point in human history, reminding us how fragile life truly is.
It started on an ordinary autumn morning, Messina, Sicily, 1347. The kind of morning that carried the smell of salt, the cries of gulls, and the chatter of fishermen hauling in their nets. Nothing unusual, until one man noticed sails on the horizon, Genoese ships limping into the harbor. He wiped his hands, raised a wave, but no one waved back. Curiosity pulled him closer. He boarded one of the vessels, boots echoing on the creaking wood. That's when the smell hit him. Not the brine of the sea, not the stink of fish. Something thicker, rotten, unnatural. Bodies, sprawled across the deck like discarded dolls. Some already still, others twitching in fever. Faces darkened, lymph nodes swollen grotesquely, as though something inside was tearing them apart. This wasn't cargo. This was a crime scene. The fishermen didn't know it, but these ships had carried more than silk, spices, or silver. They had carried a killer, and not just any killer, something invisible, relentless, efficient. Within months, entire towns would vanish. Within years, 75 to 200 million would be gone. We call it the Black Death. But to understand its arrival, you have to think like an investigator. You have to rewind the case, step back through the evidence, and ask, where did the killer come from? Europe in the 1340s was no fragile wasteland. It was thriving, populations booming, cities glittering with cathedrals that scraped the heavens. Scholars convinced they had unlocked the very rules of God's universe. Trade routes buzzing, wealth flowing, a civilization at its peak. And yet, every peak casts a shadow. The Great Famine had already shown how thin the line was between abundance and collapse. Urban density, constant trade, human contact pressed into tight medieval streets, the perfect hunting ground. The plague didn't just appear in Messina like a ghost. It traveled, it infiltrated. Like a criminal crossing borders under false names, slipping past checkpoints, leaving bodies in its wake. And if Messina was the first scene we uncovered, it wasn't the beginning. The trail stretched back further, through ports, markets, battlefields, and mountain passes, back to a silent valley in Central Asia, where something ancient stirred in the shadows of rodent burrows. The killer's first crime scene, the birthplace of history's greatest mass murderer. Every investigation has to start somewhere. For this case, the fingerprints lead us far from the harbors of Sicily, deep into the windswept mountains of Central Asia, the Tian Shan Range, Kyrgyzstan, a cold, desolate valley, 1338. Archaeologists today would call it a clue. Gravestones dated with chilling precision, whole families wiped out in the same year. Cause of death? The same microscopic suspect that would one day earn the name Yersinia pestis. For centuries, this bacterium had lived quietly in rodents, marmots, ground squirrels, animals barely noticed by passing traders. But then, something shifted. Climate fluctuations, human expansion, or maybe just the cruel arithmetic of mutation. Whatever the trigger, the pathogen changed its modus operandi. No longer content with its old hosts, it leapt into humans. And once it did, it found the perfect getaway car, the Silk Road. Picture it. A vast network of trade routes stretching from China to Europe. Silk, spices, furs, silver, all of it moving like blood through the arteries of civilization. And hidden inside that flow, something else. A parasite riding fleas, the fleas riding rats, the rats stowing away on caravans and ships, the killer concealed inside the cargo. Think of the Silk Road as the medieval internet. Ideas, luxuries, information, and viruses moving at the speed of human ambition. Just as our own digital highways today carry both innovation and malware, these dirt tracks and caravanserais carried both prosperity and pestilence. The Mongols ruled these roads in the 14th century. Warriors, traders, empire builders. They connected east and west more than any dynasty before them, but in doing so, they also became unwitting accomplices. Armies and merchants carried the disease westward. Horses, wagons, saddlebags, all tainted with invisible evidence. By the mid-1345s, the trail led to a Crimean port, Kaffa. There, in 1346, the investigation hits one of its darkest chapters. The Mongol army besieging the city suddenly fell ill. Thousands of their soldiers, once fierce and disciplined, now reduced to fevered corpses. Their commander, desperate and vengeful, made a decision that feels ripped from the files of biological warfare. He ordered the bodies catapulted over the walls, piles of infected corpses crashing into the city streets, bursting open like grotesque evidence bags. Witnesses said it was as though mountains of dead rained down. The defenders of Kaffa, trapped inside, could not fight, could not flee. Panic spread faster than fire. And then, the crucial mistake. The Genoese merchants in Kaffa, desperate to escape, loaded their ships and fled across the Black Sea. They thought they were running from death. Instead, they were smuggling it. In the bilges of their galleys, rats scurried. On their rats, fleas fed. And in those fleas, the killer waited. Silent, patient, ready for its European debut. The trail was about to circle back to Messina, Sicily, and once it landed there, the case would explode across an entire continent. October 1347, Sicily. The Genoese galleys limped into the harbor of Messina like suspects returning to the scene of the crime. To the dockworkers and townsfolk, they looked like ordinary trade ships, battered but familiar. But when officials climbed aboard, what they found wasn't cargo, it was carnage. Sailors sprawled across the deck, their bodies marked by grotesque swelling. Lymph nodes ballooned to the size of fists, skin blackened as if charred from the inside out. Some still clung to life, coughing blood, their voices broken into animal moans. Others were already gone, unburied, unblessed, unrecognizable. The city panicked. Authorities ordered the ships out, trying to cast death back to sea. But containment was impossible. Rats had already scurried down the ropes. Fleas had already jumped to new hosts. Invisible suspects had already escaped custody. Messina became the first domino. Within weeks, the trail of devastation spread to Genoa and Venice. Commercial giants, arteries of trade and movement. The plague traveled like contraband, hidden in every sack of grain, every bale of cloth, every barrel of wine. No roadblock could stop it. No guard could see it. By 1348, France was engulfed. Paris, the beating heart of medieval Europe, became an open-air morgue. Chroniclers wrote of streets littered with corpses, churches overflowing with bodies stacked like firewood. Bells tolled constantly until, in some districts, no one was left alive to ring them. One Parisian priest sent a chilling report: "The city has become a tomb. We who remain walk among the dead and know not if we shall join them by evening." Florence fared no better. Giovanni Boccaccio, a witness and writer, recorded how families vanished overnight. Breakfast with kin, supper with ancestors, houses left open, gardens untended, whole neighborhoods reduced to silence. In his words, bodies were buried in mass graves, as merchandise stowed in the hold of a ship. Imagine being a child in those streets. Your parents gone, neighbors vanished. Bells that once marked weddings or holy days now tolled only for the dead, until silence took even that. And still, the killer advanced. London. The Thames carried not just trade, but corpses, floated downstream for disposal. entire burial grounds filled within weeks. Archaeologists at East Smithfield would later uncover mass graves crammed with thousands of bodies, each skeleton carrying the signature lesions of the plague. But the most haunting evidence wasn't found in great capitals. It lay in the countryside, villages erased from the map. Tusmore in Oxfordshire, once a living, breathing community, wiped clean, its fields reverting to wilderness, its name surviving only in forgotten records. By 1350, Europe itself looked like a crime scene. 1/3 of the population, 25 million lives, had been erased. Some regions suffered losses of 50, even 60%. Entire bloodlines extinguished, institutions collapsing under the weight of the dead. This wasn't just a disease. This was a serial killer operating on a continental scale, and no one could stop it. Every investigation reveals not just the crime, but the way society responds to it. And Europe's response to the Black Death tells a story as chilling as the plague itself. At first, fear bred denial. Families tried to carry on, pretending the bodies piling up next door weren't a warning. But when fathers abandoned children and priests refused last rites, it became clear. The social contract had collapsed. Contemporary witnesses painted the picture like a detective sketching a crime scene. In Florence, Boccaccio noted that brother was forsaken by brother. Fathers and mothers abandoned their own children as if they had been strangers. In Paris, survivors walked streets lined with corpses, their minds broken, their faith shaken. In small villages, the effect was total. Entire communities erased, their churches empty shells, their fields reclaimed by weeds. Trust evaporated. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. A cough, a rash, a smell. Any sign could mark you as the next victim. And then came the rumors. Some said strange figures in dark cloaks wandered at night, marking doors where death would soon strike. Others swore they could smell the plague before it arrived, a stench that hung in the air like a criminal's calling card. A French chronicle whispered of seeing death himself, tall, cloaked, pointing at houses like a judge condemning them. Medicine offered no refuge. The experts of the age, armed with Greek philosophy and church doctrine, were powerless. They prescribed bloodletting, potions of herbs, even powdered emeralds and unicorn horn. None worked. Their failure cracked the bedrock of trust in institutions. If doctors could not stop this killer, what else was a lie? With no cure in sight, desperation turned to madness. In Germany and the Low Countries, flagellants marched through towns, bands of men whipping themselves bloody in public squares, chanting for God's mercy. To them, the plague was divine punishment, and pain was their penance. But their processions, packed with bodies and blood, often spread the disease faster, turning salvation into contamination. Worse still, the search for scapegoats began. Jews, already marginalized, became the accused. Whispers spread that they had poisoned wells, conspired with the devil, or sought to destroy Christendom itself. In Strasbourg, entire Jewish communities were burned alive. Across France and Germany, thousands were massacred, not by plague, but by human hands. One Jewish merchant, shortly before his execution, left testimony like a final plea in a case file. "We die as you die. We weep as you weep. Yet you call us the authors of this misery." What madness drives suffering to multiply itself with hatred? It was as if, faced with an enemy they could not see, people invented enemies they could kill. By the early 1350s, Europe looked less like a civilization under siege and more like a crime scene out of control. Institutions buckled, feudal bonds dissolved, monasteries stood empty, their centuries of knowledge left to dust. Markets stopped, banks collapsed. Even the basic duty to bury the dead was abandoned. Mass graves overflowed, and bodies burned in open pits. The real horror wasn't just the deaths. It was the unraveling of order, the exposure of how thin the fabric of society truly was. Every crime scene tells two stories, the violence itself and what survives after. The Black Death was no different. When the plague finally loosened its grip in the early 1350s, The killer left behind not just millions of graves, but a transformed society. The demographics were shattered. Up to half of Europe's population was gone. Entire bloodlines erased, villages abandoned, dynasties cut short. But in the vacuum, survivors found leverage. Labor, once abundant and cheap, became scarce and precious. Peasants who had once bowed to lords now had bargaining power. An English farmer captured it bluntly in a petition. "My lord, the fields lie fallow, not for want of seed, but for want of hands. If you would have grain, you must offer more than custom demands." Parliament tried to freeze wages with the Statute of Laborers in 1351, but the law could not bind reality. The balance of power shifted, feudal bonds frayed. The first cracks in Europe's old order had appeared, not by sword, but by plague. The church too bore scars. Its priests had died in staggering numbers, many while administering last rites. Monasteries, once bastions of learning, lay empty. Survivors began questioning whether the clergy, who had claimed to interpret God's will, truly had answers. Reform movements simmered, some seeking direct spiritual experience without intermediaries. Faith did not vanish, but trust in institutions eroded. Intellectually, the plague planted seeds of doubt. If the best minds of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford had been powerless, maybe knowledge itself needed new foundations. Over time, this suspicion would fuel the Renaissance and, centuries later, modern science. Culturally, the evidence is unmistakable. Art filled with skeletons, skulls, and the danse macabre, the dance of death, where kings and peasants alike marched toward the grave. Literature turned raw, stripped of illusions. Mortality became not just a fact, but an obsession. Even medicine changed course. Medieval doctors had trusted ancient texts, but after the plague's failure, a new priority emerged: empirical observation. Watch, record, test, the very mindset that would, centuries later, give birth to modern medicine. And yet, perhaps the most enduring legacy wasn't intellectual, but human. A survivor in Paris wrote after the dust settled, "We who remain are fewer, but perhaps wiser. We have seen the worst that fate can bring, and yet we still plant seeds for next year's harvest. If this is not hope, what is?" That's the paradox of the Black Death. It was humanity's darkest hour, but also a brutal teacher. It revealed fragility, yet forced resilience. It destroyed, yet compelled renewal. The killer's rampage ended not because it was caught, but because it ran out of hosts. And in its wake, Europe stood dazed, transformed, forever marked. Case file closed? Not exactly. The Black Death receded in the early 1350s, but it never disappeared. The killer didn't vanish, it adapted, retreated, waited. Outbreaks flared for centuries afterward. London, 1665. Marseille, 1720. Even as late as the 19th century, the plague struck again in waves. Each time, society thought it had left the darkness behind. Each time, the suspect returned, proving that history's deadliest criminal never truly retired. But the true ending isn't about the pathogen. It's about us. The Black Death forced Europe to rebuild itself from the ground up. Labor revolutions, challenges to the church, seeds of science and Renaissance thinking, entirely new ways of seeing human life, not as pawns in divine punishment, but as beings capable of questioning, adapting, resisting. And yet, the warning lingers. Our world today is even more connected than the medieval Silk Road. Planes instead of caravans, global trade routes instead of dirt paths. Viruses don't need years to travel continents anymore. They need hours. Sound familiar? The case files of the 21st century already bear unsettling echoes. Quarantines, masks, mass graves, conspiracy theories, scapegoats. The same patterns repeat, like fingerprints across centuries. Different names, COVID-19 instead of Black Death. Different tools, ventilators instead of bloodletting. But the same human vulnerability. The same desperate search for answers. The same temptation to blame others rather than face the invisible enemy. So, What does the Black Death really leave us with? Not just a record of horror, but a question. What happens the next time the killer returns? Because history suggests it's not if, but when. And when it does, will we stand divided, turning on each other as in 1348? Or will we remember the lessons carved into Europe's gravestones? The lesson that survival depends not just on medicine, but on solidarity. The Black Death was Europe's greatest reckoning with mortality, but it also revealed humanity's greatest strength, the ability to endure, to adapt, and to rise again from the ashes. The case may be archived, but it isn't closed. The question hangs in the air like an unsolved mystery. But was that really the whole story? Or just the first chapter of an investigation still unfolding?